your source for all things business, technology, strategy, and change. If you're growing your business, leading change within your organization, or undertaking any sort of operational or technology change initiative, this podcast is for you. This show covers what you need to know about digital transformation, organizational change, operational improvement, and business growth.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
And now, here's your host, Eric Kimberling.
Hello, welcome to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 75. My name is Eric Kimberling here with Kyler Cheatham. Kyler, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, as always.
This is the podcast that has everything to do with digital transformation. We cover the people, process, technology, and strategy sides of transformation. And we premiere new episodes every Wednesday. You can find new episodes on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, as well as all of the audio podcast platforms. So be sure to check us out. And thanks for supporting the show. And be sure to share this show with any colleagues that you think might be interested in this content. I've got a great show for you today. I'm excited for some of these topics. I'm excited for all the topics, to be candid. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about them if you and I weren't excited about them.
Very true.
I know. Funny how that works, isn't it? If there's a bias, it's that we cover topics that are of interest.
Yeah.
So we're going to break this into three segments like we always do, or we typically do on this podcast. First, we're going to start off with some of the hot topics in the news, some trends and emerging developments that you should be aware of. First thing we're going to talk about within those hot topics, we're going to cover the Big Four split, the Big Four consulting split, consulting versus audit. I feel like it's an episode of Groundhog Day because earlier in my career, I feel like I already went through this once and now we're going through it again where we're splitting up audit and consulting. So we're going to talk about some recent developments in the Big Four world, which is pretty seismic in my opinion, even though it's happened before and we kind of know how this all plays out. It's interesting to see history repeating itself there. So we're going to talk about what that means to the world of consulting and digital transformation. We're also going to talk about supply chain managers that are jumping ship. That can't be a good thing for a number of reasons, given where we are with inflation and supply chain bottlenecks and all that stuff. We'll unpack that a bit more. We're going to talk about data science versus analytics. And then we're also going to cover the workplace of 2027. I'm fascinated to see what that means. And then later in the show, we're going to have Wayne Holtham on the show talking about enterprise asset management. He's going to provide us an overview of asset management, what it is, how technology can enable better enterprise asset management, and ultimately provide you an overview to help figure out if that's something that you should be thinking about as an organization. And then last but not least, we are going to have a session later on with Cameron Carpenter and Brian LaCarrubba from the Third Stage Consulting team, talking about what is business process management. So we're going to talk about everything to do with business process management. So if you're interested in process reengineering, you're wondering how to do it, what are the things to think about and keep in mind? What are the pitfalls, lessons learned, all that good stuff? Stay tuned for that third segment because we'll cover it there. But before we bring on those guests, let's dive into these hot topics, Kyler.
Absolutely. So let's start with kind of that industry news piece for the Big Four, splitting those audit versus business advisory services. So just some background here is we have the Securities Exchange Commission, the SEC, is investigating the conflicts of interest when it comes to actually doing business advisory services for your clients and the audits for their business. So we look at the Big Four, like Ernst & Young recently did that, and then Deloitte is on track to do that as well. So something I wanted to get or dive deeper in with you is when it comes to this audit work, it seems as though that is kind of going down as a revenue stream and the business advisory services are going up. But the audit work has been kind of a core piece of, it seems like, their business for such a long time. So are they doing this because it's a good business decision, or are they doing this because they're under scrutiny from regulatory practices? And this is just in North America. If we go to the UK, which is much more strict on those types of regulatory compliance issues, what's the motivation there? Can you help us understand?
As far as why they'd want to split up?
Yeah, as far as
Yeah.
why are they doing this because they're under pressure from regulatory agencies, or are they doing this because they feel as though it's a good business decision and they're kind of just following suit? You had mentioned that you kind of saw the writing on the wall many years ago, or went through that many years ago. Many years ago, many.
Yeah, way back. I mean, most of you weren't even alive back
I
then.
know. I definitely wasn't, for
You were
sure.
not alive when this. Well, you were a kid. You were
Yeah.
probably I don't know what you were
Anyway,
at that time, but
yeah.
probably was not. You were probably not following Big Four consulting back at that point.
Probably not. No, I wasn't, but I'm glad to be now. So, so if
Well,
you
it'd
could
be
just kind of give us a little lift the veil, if you will, for the motivation there.
sure. I feel like I need a pipe, like the old timer that's telling you the story of the back in the day, how things
Yeah,
worked.
the
I don't have
fireside chats with Teddy Roosevelt.
right, exactly. I'm not quite that old yet, but yeah, I'll take a stab at it. So, so I've been following this pretty closely, and actually, I've always wondered, just to kind of back, and I've always wondered how we got from the early 2000s when I was early in my career, when they did split up. Arthur Andersen, for example, split off their consulting group, which became Accenture. Now Accenture is a juggernaut in the big system integrator, Big Four consulting space. Or actually, they're technically not the Big Four, but I was kind of lumped them in with the Big Four, even though I don't think they're technically one of the Big Four. But anyway, they split off for if you recall, or you may have read in history books or something. I don't know where you would have read this, but when Accenture spun off, or shortly after Accenture spun off, it was right around the time when Arthur Andersen got in trouble with the whole Enron debacle. If you remember the Enron debacle, they sort of overlooked some pretty significant regulatory violations in terms of how Enron was establishing these shell companies and basically, misleading investors and ripping people off. So they got busted for that. That was a big deal back, 20 years ago. And as a result, the whole industry shifted to this model of separating consulting from audit, partly because of that risk. There's a conflict of interest. There's a risk there. And the biggest thing, I think, is not only the regulatory scrutiny, which they are under it, and I think that is a definite conflict when you do audit and consulting, because the rationale for that being a conflict is that if you're an auditor, and let's just say I work for the audit side of the company, you work for the consulting side, you're probably going to pressure me to take it easy on them because they're your client too, and you don't want me to make life too difficult for them or detract from the consulting work, which is higher margin, higher dollar stuff. I might be more inclined to take it easy on them to not jeopardize that work. So there is a conflict there from a regulatory perspective. And so what that does is it creates a challenge where a lot of these big consulting firms won't or can't do consulting work and audit work for the same clients. Sometimes they usually have to pick and choose. And so what this does by splitting up is it not only avoids that regulatory problem, but it allows them to grow faster because now they don't have to worry about any conflicts of interest. Although I will argue that there are much larger conflicts of interest that government regulators should be concerned with, other than just the audit and consulting conflict. I think there's tons of conflicts of interest in big consulting firms, and I think they're too big, to be candid. And I'm not an anti-business person by any means, but I do think Accenture, Deloitte, E&Y, some of those guys are just too big, and I think they should be split up. That's just a personal opinion. That may come back to bite me at some point, but that's what I think. So I think it's something that it's part reactive and part strategic. They're trying to think ahead to how can they fuel growth, and one way to fuel growth is to get rid of the regulatory obstacles they have right now.
So can you clarify, a lot of times when we're talking to clients and we compete against their audit firm because it's a relationship that they already have. So a lot of times they come in and we try to explain, that's not a great coupling because it's not completely independent and agnostic, right? There's other motivations involved in that relationship. Why is it that it's so normal for other companies to be involved in audit and digital transformation, but with these big four companies, it can become a real problem? What's the discrepancy there?
Well, I don't know that it is common for other firms to do both consulting. I mean, they're all doing it right now, I guess, just to back up. I mean, that's the whole reason they're splitting up is because they are doing both. But the key is that they're not supposed to be doing it for the same clients. So, so what ends up happening is a company will hire Deloitte to be their auditor, and then they'll hire KPMG to do the consulting work to keep that separation. But the way Deloitte would look at that is, well, why can't we do both?
Yeah.
And the way to do both would be to split up your audit and your consulting practice. I personally think that's just for show. I think you're still going to have a conflict of interest. If you and I work for the same company now and we split up, chances are, even if it's not a formal partnership, chances are you and I are still going to preserve that relationship and that connection, and that by maybe unintentional results, that conflict of interest is still going to be there. It's just now we've skirted the technical regulatory issue there.
So can you give us some recommendations for a business that may have a relationship with the Big Four or might have an audit relationship, and understanding the difference there? What should they be looking for in consultant services versus audit services?
I can't speak that well to audit because I never was on the audit side. I've always been on the consulting side. So I don't really know what they should look for there. But I can tell you on the consulting services side, what you want to look for, and also maybe even more importantly, what you don't want to look for. What you do want to look for is, the right project team and the right competencies that you need to support your transformation. What I would not do, though, is become overly dependent to where you completely outsource everything to one of these big consulting firms, because what happens is the dynamic we see a lot of times with companies that become overly dependent on these firms is they'll have these big consulting firms that are doing their digital transformation, they're doing their managed services, they're doing some business process outsourcing. And at some point it gets to the point where is this our company, or is our company being completely outsourced to a third party that has a conflict of interest? Even if you do split off the audit side, you still have other conflicts of interest. And by the way, then we don't have ownership of this project anymore once we do that. So I guess that would be the thing, is avoid that temptation to just, want to have that one-stop shop, full turnkey solution that sounds good in theory, but it actually creates a lot more problems, in my opinion, oftentimes than it solves.
Interesting. Definitely a story in which we'll continue to follow, because I think it's something that as we go through these changes in the industry, it's important to talk about them and talk about the best practices and understanding your partners, since there is so much bias within the industry right now. And our goal is to bring that agnostic and independent conversation to our audience and our client community. So we'll definitely continue to follow that. So one other thing I wanted to talk about on the trending side is there was a study done by LinkedIn, which obviously is one of the world's biggest professional platforms, that the separation for specifically supply chain managers grew by 28% last year. So there seems to be this large migration and burnout within that supply chain manager tier. So I wanted to see, if you are a business, your supply chain is stressed just because of things that are not in your controllables, you can integrate strategies to make your supply chain healthier, more efficient. But at the end of the day, it is going to be, in our current state, a bit more work or labor for that supply chain team to continue to get creative and source the best strategies to keep the supply chain going. What would you as a business leader do to make sure that your supply chain team is not suffering from this burnout or creating that attrition and employee overall engagement to stay within the positions there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think if anything, it's a good reminder how integrated organizations are, in that, there's so much that we can be doing better from a digital and an automation perspective to make people's lives easier. When you look at supply chain management in particular, you have two problems, sort of two battles happening within the world of supply chain management. On one hand, it's what you describe, which is people are leaving their jobs. There's a lot of attrition. There's a lot of unfilled jobs in the supply chain management world. And then the other front that there's a battle brewing is just the idea that the supply chain has so fundamentally shifted and changed since the pandemic. It's exposed a lot of weaknesses and bottlenecks and deficiencies with the global supply chain as we once knew it. And so organizations are trying to re-engineer in real time what those supply chains look like and how they work. And, kind of a third or maybe a second and a half, part two and a half of that that same point is that organizations are now or should be looking at technologies and automation, integration, and ways to really ease some of that pressure and dependency on the supply chain itself, but also on supply chain employees too. Part of that goes back to just giving them the tools they need to do their job effectively within supply chain management. But then that also begs the question of things like human capital management and how can we better attract and retain really good supply chain managers and procurement specialists, logistics specialists, and people that are so critical to unraveling this, unwinding this supply chain problem that's going on in the world right now. So I think it's just a good reminder. We've got to look at our entire organization, and this problem is something that requires an integrated solution from a people, process, and technology perspective.
Yeah, and even utilizing those platforms to just have visibility to that burnout and anticipate that. What is kind of the current culture or subculture of your supply chain management community? Are they really struggling? And can you monitor that via data and come in and provide support before you have employees leaving because of, just additional pressures? So I think that using that HR tech, right, and being able to kind of have visibility into their experience is kind of key to, like you said, having kind of a holistic view of the business and making sure that you are attracting that top talent or talent that fits the organization, right? So
yeah, and even if people aren't suffering from total burnout and you yourself as an organization are not struggling with attrition in your supply chain, it doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. And, even if the problem isn't you necessarily, let's just say you have a well-oiled machine and people like working for you, there's so much demand for supply chain jobs right now that there's always competition trying to get your people and poach your people. So you really have to think of it defensively too. How can we, even if we're not having these attrition problems now, let's assume we might in the future. So what can we do to really tighten up and bolster our, employee engagement, our employee satisfaction, giving them world-class tools to do their jobs better and to be more effective at their jobs? All those things are just going to mitigate that risk of losing people as a result of either stress and or the fact that those jobs are in such high demand right now.
Absolutely. Good point. Proactive strategies, certainly. Absolutely. So that brings me kind of to our next, I would say, professional argument as well. So we have data science versus data analytics. So these two different pieces of data management, right? There's a recent study that kind of separated what is data science versus data analytics. And so data science, according to this study, is typically the science of studying data. So machine learning, predictive analytics, understanding those types of emerging technologies within data and how that affects the different data capture, data points, those types of different pieces. Data analytics is more of a historical type of data. So you'd look at how the business performed last year or any function of the business and use that raw data. It's harder skills. We're talking about coding. We're talking about more technical skill set. So in just kind of looking at these two different pieces, I kind of wanted to ask you, because I'm super curious, do you think that the data analytics or data analysis or analysts or whomever in that role, like the data scientists, because they've kind of come in and leveraged these platforms, which is not a bad thing, right? That kind of massage the data, get it into these dashboards, and then their job is consuming it to create actionable insight and create a positive impact on the business, right? By using all of these different things, but they're not going into their spreadsheet and really getting their hands dirty like these data analysts have done in the past. So I'm wondering what you think that perception is kind of within that sphere and kind of the rise of the business technologists and that data prone culture.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I hadn't really thought about it, and I don't know that I've seen anything that gives me I haven't seen anything with our clients that gives me a clear answer to that, other than to say, I think there would be a recognition that there's a good balance there, and it's sort of like yin and yang. you kind of need both. They're very different skills. You need the more technical data focused person, but then you need the person that can actually make sense of the data. Just because, for example, just because you have a good business intelligence tool with great dashboards that gives you a bunch of readouts and dashboards that give you a pulse on the health of the company, you still need to know what that means. You have to understand what those numbers tell you, and you also have to understand what's going on below the surface of those top line numbers that you might be looking at, whatever they are, whether they're financial or operational or customer driven or whatever. So I don't know. I think, one can't do their jobs effectively without the other. So you kind of need both. I don't know that, but as far as whether they like each other, I don't know. I guess it'd be maybe they like each other, but it might be harder to relate to one another. If you're, because I know sometimes I get frustrated by really technical types of people because they don't understand the business, and I think they get frustrated with me at times because I don't fully understand the code and how the technology was built and that sort of thing. So there is, there's sort of your wires get crossed in that way that you might speak or whatever. But I think it's something they've got to figure out because they have to work together. So.
Yeah, and maybe do they like each other wasn't the best analogy, but we have so much of that tribal knowledge we see in organizations with those data analysts, right? They've owned those spreadsheets, they've built those processes. So being able to create some organizational change and process change where hopefully they can now embrace this other level of being able to consume and communicate the data. But I just thought it was an interesting contrast of people that actually really mine that data and people that use it to create actionable strategies. So you're right. Yeah. One cannot live without the other.
Yeah.
I think that's like a Star Wars quote or something like that.
Yeah. It's kind of like my wife and I. I mean, we have our personalities couldn't be much different, but we balance each other out really well. But if we don't pay attention, or if we're not careful, it also leads to a lot of miscommunication, because we have such different communication styles and personalities and all that stuff. So, and I imagine, for a lot of you listening that have spouses or significant others or have in the past, or just friendships, professional relationships or whatever, I think that's true in a lot of cases. So you kind of relate it to that in that way. I think we can all relate to that in that personal level.
Absolutely. You heard it here, folks. Once again, digital transformation equals relationship therapy. So we are here to provide whatever service you need when it comes to advisory.
Solving all sorts of the world's problems here in this podcast. The only podcast where you're going to find these sorts of answers.
Yes, it's very, very versatile. So absolutely. But I think that is a good kind of comparison to the two of just, you need two sides of each skill set in any discipline to make sure that you have a balance that's going to be healthy for the organization. So thanks for your feedback on that. So the workplace of 2027 is our last hot topic today. And it always kind of cracks me up because, you'd have the workplace of 2020, whatever, it's not really 2027, but I think it comes up with some interesting points, this study that took a lot of different polls when it came to bigger companies, smaller companies, just what essentially businesses will look like and that human-centric type of approach. And I have to be honest, when I hear human-centric, I kind of roll my eyes. And I will share an unpopular opinion per your set the stage on TikTok with your, work in the office, which got a lot of attention. But I guess maybe it's my background. I came from that we all work, we all eat mentality. And so I think there's a super fine line between getting benefits for an employee and making sure that the employee experience is optimized, making sure they feel valued, totally important. But now I think we've almost created a monster in a workforce that thinks that's what they deserve. So when you look at these studies, you'll see all of these different benefits that come into employees' personal lives, donating to philanthropic causes, all of these different pieces that to me, it creates a lot of noise just within the strategic approach of the business, because it is a business, right? That's its job, is to make money and service to employees. So I wanted to get your feedback on my unpopular opinion that maybe we've gone a bit too human centric, and we might want to focus on balancing actually making money as a business, creating revenue, profits, and ROI, and our employees.
Yeah, it's a controversial topic for sure, and I love to throw myself into that
Hmm.
controversial discussion. Much like, by the way, Elon Musk just did a couple weeks ago. He kind of came out and said, not only did he come out and say all of his employees at Tesla and SpaceX are going to they need to get back to work or get back to the office, but he came out and said if they don't like it, they can go pretend. He used the word, they can go pretend to work somewhere else, insinuating that they're just pretending to work by not being in the office. I think that might be a little extreme. I wouldn't go that far, especially with our, for our team. We're highly educated. We're sort of at the tip of Maslow's hierarchy. We're at that top level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But this whole work from home thing, it drives me crazy in so many ways. Not because I necessarily disagree with the whole work from home thing. I think there is a middle ground, a happy medium there somewhere where, yeah, you're in the office sometimes. You don't necessarily need to be there all the time. But I don't believe in the full, just work remotely 100%, unless you're a developer or something like that, where you don't really need any sort of meaningful human interaction. But I think the bigger problem I have with it is that this is there's such a narrow percent of the population that this discussion is even relevant to, that, 95% of the world cannot. It's like, speaking of noise, it's like, what do you mean work from home? I have to go to the factory or I have to go to the warehouse. I don't have the option. These are the guys and gals that were working with masks and all these PPE equipment while we're all sitting at home complaining about how someday we might have to go to the office. So it actually kind of irritates me, because they're the ones that kept the economy going. If you think about it, during the pandemic, it was 95% of the world that was out there doing the real work in the world. And there's people like you and me and consultants and other white collar office workers that are sitting here debating whether or not we should work from home, forever. So it just drives me crazy, because I feel like it's so out of touch with reality. And, don't get me wrong, most of the people we interact with at our clients, like especially me, I'm mostly dealing with C-level people where, yeah, they have the luxury of potentially working from home. And maybe they, a lot of them are working from home a lot of the time. And even the office workers, a lot of them are still working from home, or there's some sort of hybrid. But most of the people that are impacted by the work we do, as far as like digital transformation and people process technology type changes, most of those people don't even have this option. So to me, it's just like, stop talking about it. I don't want to talk about it anymore. So, I have my own opinion. Every leader is going to have their opinion. But I do think, though, I honestly believe the reason there's so much like social media and sort of mainstream pushback on the idea of going back to the office is because the tail's wagging the dog now. People would rather work from home. And if I'm an average person that has that option, of course, I'm going to want to work from home, because there's a whole bunch of reasons why. Because I don't have to shower in the morning. I don't have to drive. I don't have to deal with getting interrupted at the office. I can take my kids to school. There's a million reasons why personally I would want to work from home full time. But the reality is we're all here to, we're here to run a business. We're not here to make our lives easier necessarily. I mean, we like to make it easier at the same time, but you also have to run the business. And I think you're right. The pendulum swung too far that way. I think it needs to settle somewhere in the middle there for sure.
Absolutely. Well, I think that, that's all it, to your point, it really has to be, it has to work for the organization, right? Whether we're talking about a work from home, but I think really having that conversation about different areas of work is really important. Me as a parent, when the pandemic happened, I had 2 young kids at home and no childcare. But at the end of the day, I could work from home. I mean, I don't know how you work with 2 toddlers, but I didn't have to look at them and go to a physical job and figure out cared for. So, that is something that I think is a really important consideration. And then I think it's also really refreshing to have a business that of course values their employees, that develops them, that gives them new skill sets, that challenges them, that makes them better employees. But there is also a very refreshing mantra of sometimes people just don't match the organization. It's just like your relationship scenario. One person cannot do all the work, right? So I think that meet in the middle piece of that. And I'm looking forward to kind of normalizing the conversation that this has to be best for my business culture, not so much for the employee working from home. I really hope they enjoy their job here, but it's not the business's job to go out and completely transform their overall DNA, their operations, to meet the employee because they don't want to leave their dog during the day. So sorry about, you can end our TED talk here, but I do think that it's a important piece of conversation for those employees, for those businesses, that it has to be what you want it to be, where you feel valued, where you feel as though you can make an impact. Same on the business side, that you have a team you can count on. No matter where you are physically or what you're doing as far as initiatives and strategies. So
here's something here's a way I would think about it. If you're on a digital transformation team, let's just say you're part of a project team, even if you're not an executive, let's just say you're on a project team. The way I would think about it is, we can sit here and talk about whether or not you, as a project team member, should have the ability to work from home, work remotely 100%. Let's just say the answer is yes, you should be able to, and you're going to do that. We have to look is beyond that and say, okay, I'm a key part of a big transformation that's going to affect my entire organization. And for most organizations, except for companies like ours that are in professional services or, other white collar types of roles, that's a small percentage of the overall working population. Most organizations have frontline workers that don't have the option of working from home. So if you're on a digital transformation project team, which is a majority of this audience here listening, you have to think about how that comes across. I mean, you're here trying to manage and lead the change and lead the way for all these people. And if you're saying, I'm not coming in the office because I don't have to, I can do this all over Zoom, that's just a bad look, in my opinion. You've completely lost your audience. And I'm a change management person at heart. And I think that's, a lot of change management people think, well, you should let people do whatever they want, work from home, and to your point, become really human centric. And I think you do need some of that, but you also need to be able to relate to them too. And I think it's totally unrelatable when you come out and say, I'm part of a transformation team, whether I'm a consultant or internal employee, and I'm just going to work 100% remotely. It just doesn't look good. We had a not to air too much dirty laundry about our own company, but we had an employee recently that interviewed great. Everyone loved her. She came on board and she was like, I refuse to come to the office, like, ever, not even to meet the team once. And she was based here in Denver, where we're based, where our headquarters are. And she also refused to travel to clients because you don't have to, right? In today's day and age, you can just do it all over Zoom. And she didn't last more than like 3 or 4 months, just because she just never connected with the organization. She never connected with our clients. And you can't do our kind of work without connecting. And if you're doing any sort of transformation, you need to connect with people. You need to relate. And you can't relate to people if you're not kind of standing with them side by side. I still remember during the pandemic, I think I might have mentioned this on a previous podcast several weeks ago, but I'll tell it again because it's highly relevant here. But I was on during the pandemic, I was working from home, like a lot of us were. And I was waiting for this client to get on the call. It was a potential client. And he was the CEO of a manufacturing company. And right as he got on, I unmuted my line and my dog starts barking. And I noticed, like, as my dog's barking, I'm trying to get my dogs to be quiet. He's clearly in the office and he's got his orange vest on because he was clearly just out on the shop floor, comes rolling in, straight off the shop floor to take this meeting with me. And it just, at that moment, I had this feeling of like, I'm not connecting with this guy at all. That he can't relate to me sitting at home with my dog barking in the background. He's been here through the entire pandemic. I guarantee you, going in that warehouse every day while we're sitting at home, dreading the day that we might someday have to go back to the office. So right then I was like, it's a mismatch. I'm not connecting with this guy. I'm not relatable. I'm not empathizing. So anyway, I know that's a rant, but I feel very strongly about it. And I think to lead transformations effectively, especially the people side, you have to be able to empathize and you have to be in the front lines doing the stuff you may not want to do, but guess what? Most of the world's doing stuff they don't want to do necessarily either. So I'm old school that way, I suppose. So that's what you get with an old timer like me.
Oh man. Well, I think that it goes to kind of our conversation from last week too, is how do you how do you create an impact and understand the front lines behavior or experience for those multinational organizations if you can't be there? That's very difficult to do. And then you don't have the insight to advise, right? You don't become a valued advisor because you don't have any information besides what you might see through a computer screen. So
Yeah.
It's definitely a very good debate. And of course, we hope that you sound off in the comments and tell us what you think, because we definitely want to know everyone's unpopular opinion. um, but I think it also goes into the industries that we talked about in person, and we should do a industries that really have always been in person. And that's a good segue into our conversation, or your conversation, I should say, with Wayne, when you talked about what is enterprise asset management, because a lot of those industries have been mining, oil and gas, utilities, shipping, those types of different industries that utilize these systems and processes. So I think that's a great segue into what he's going to talk about, and how they manage their assets, and how to optimize that overall operation process.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of blue collar and capital intensive industries are the ones that can benefit most from enterprise asset management. And I should probably share one last thing just to add some belated context to my rant about working from home. I come from a blue collar background. My parents were blue collar, so that's the way I think. So I don't. I guess in some ways I don't relate as well to white collar people complaining about working from home when my parents were struggling to get by. So the blue collar thing has a place deep in my DNA and my heart. And that's part of why this conversation with Wayne is so interesting too, is because the enterprise asset management is so focused on that. And you certainly don't have to just be a blue collar type of organization. You mentioned anything with capital intensive types of assets are something that can benefit from it. So we're going to, after a break, we're going to have Wayne Holtham, who is the head or the executive vice president of Third Stage Asia Pacific, who also happens to be an expert in enterprise asset management. He's going to be on the show talking about what is asset management and how it might apply to your organization. And the interesting thing about it is it actually applies to more organizations than you might think. Mm-hmm. And enterprise asset management is one of those capabilities that oftentimes gets overlooked in a digital transformation, but it's one that can deliver a huge amount of business value, whether you're deploying it as part of an ERP implementation or as part of just a broader best of breed solution where you have an enterprise asset management system as a integrated system. So we'll take a quick break. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control with Wayne Holtham after the break.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the 2021 Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us, or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how to take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 75. And my name is Eric Kimberling here with Kyler Cheatham. Welcome back to the show. And now we've had the promo break here for me to calm down and collect myself and introduce our next guest after the rant about working from home and that whole thing. So now you know another one of my triggers. I think as we do the show, Kyler, you're finding what my triggers are, and that's one of them. So you can feel free to push on that at any time. You just have to deal with the consequences.
Oh, I knew what I was doing. That was very strategic. I'm
nice.
No fool.
Well, that's good. So you knew what you were getting yourself into. That's good.
Yeah, that's what I wanted.
Right. Good to know. Well, I got to watch out then for the questions you might throw my way going forward. Well, speaking of triggers, or not really, it has nothing to do with triggers. I was just aiming for a transition that wasn't there. We're going to have Wayne Holtham on the show. And actually, this is a clip, an interview I did with him a couple of years ago. It was about 2 years ago. I did this clip with him. It was shortly after he joined the company, and he and I worked together with one of our clients in Australia. It was a power company, and we did some consulting work there. And part of his role was on the asset management side of things. And he's done a lot of work in the energy and utilities industry, as have I. And that's an area where enterprise asset management is especially important. But as we'll talk about in this discussion, it's relevant to a lot of different types of industries, especially if you have physical capital assets that are critical to your business. Things like construction, manufacturing with your shop floor, machinery, and that sort of thing. Lots of different types of companies. Aerospace and defense, obviously, is another one. So a lot of different companies out there struggle to manage and optimize their assets. And so enterprise asset management is something that's very relevant in digital transformation today. So what I want to do is play this clip of me interviewing Wayne back in 2020, and we're going to talk about an overview of enterprise asset management. So let's cut to the clip here.
Thanks, Eric. It's great to be here. It's good to be part of the third stage family. A bit of my background is that I've been in this space of asset management over a number of years. Came from a trade background and then went into consulting, and so a big portion of my my career has been in that delivering enterprise asset management projects. And so it's interesting that we're actually here today to talk about the differences of VAM.
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, it's great having you on the team. Our Australia office is one of the more recent offices that we've opened internationally. And you and I have worked together for some time, even before you becoming part of Third Stage. So it's good to have you on board. Now, talking about enterprise asset management, that's something that some people may have heard of, some people listening may have heard of, some may not have. But what is, if you were to simplify for the layperson or someone who's not familiar with the term, what exactly is enterprise asset management?
It's about managing your assets so that you can actually plan and schedule and maintain them effectively. But you need to leverage a lot of your other ERP type functions, so your HCM, your finance, and so it leverages all of that. But it takes the next layer of complexity because you need to plan and schedule, and you need to have intelligence about your assets and understand what your assets are and what they should perform like. So it's a bit more detail that overlays it, other than just an ERP. Yeah.
So asset intensive companies are investing heavily in capital assets. I imagine that's a pretty important technology. What are some of those industries, though, that would benefit the most, or that most commonly would be drawn to enterprise asset management technology?
Mining, oil and gas have always been the traditional players of enterprise asset management. These days, a bit more has come into the fray of companies that end up as an infrastructure as a service. So a utility, electricity utility, a water utility, airports, shipping ports, terminals, those sort of things are all now highly asset intensive, and they need to be managed and understood on their life cycle of their assets so that they can actually maintain for a particular cost base. And so there's even governments now, health, managing hospitals, managing justice, all of the building and infrastructure they might have, universities. It's amazing how many asset intensive industries or organizations we have these days, over and above what we did in the past.
Yeah. And it seems like there's a lot of cost savings that could happen as a result of being able to manage that stuff well. And I have a question for you along those lines here in a second. So what did you, just a question along the lines of your response of what industries are using enterprise asset management? What did these sorts of industries, what did they do before enterprise asset management technology existed? Or maybe give us do you have an idea of what the history is, or what were people doing before to manage their assets and manage some of these things you're talking about?
Yeah, it was really, in the past, people would rely on their trade network or their trade base of people to come in, and they would have manual records of when something was last replaced, and they would look at it and go, well, I think it's going to last a bit longer, or it's getting noisy, so I will replace it. And so it was based on a reactive type approach. And in today's world, that's a little bit hard because we want a lot of reliability. Whereas in the past, it would break and we'd fix it. We'd just accept that. And it wasn't the pressure or the cost drivers that drove high performance. Whereas today, it's more of, we need maximum uptime. We're actually, if we're an infrastructure service provider, we want to maintain a very high service level but we don't want failures. And so it's now we need to understand what's the health of an asset. We need to be able to predict what it might be doing so that we don't have outages when we really don't want them.
Right. Yeah, I can see how that'd be of great value.
Yeah. When I first, just as a side to that, when I first started in fleet management, I took over managing a fleet of line haul trucks here in Australia, and we had a card system. That was our what we call today a CMMS, computer management maintenance system, and so it worked great. But it was one of those things. It was limited in the sense that if you didn't fill out all the information, you didn't get you didn't have a good record. Well, not a lot's changed now when we move into the computer world, because if people don't update and maintain those records, we have even a bigger problem.
Right. Yeah. Sounds like it's come a long way. It's kind of like the old punch cards, with the predecessor to ERP systems and mainframes and all that stuff. You had the old punch cards before my time, but I've heard all about them. And it seems like that similar trajectory or journey that technology evolution's been on in the EAM space as well.
Oh, definitely, yes. It's and I suppose it's caused its own level of complexity because the people that are using it are not necessarily IT savvy, and so they don't see the relevance of keeping records as detailed and information as clear and concise as what it should be. So that's usually a lot of the challenges that people face as they manage, work through, and try and improve what they do in the asset space.
That's interesting. So along those lines, then, who in an organization typically would own the enterprise asset management function and the technology that would go along with that? Who's the owner typically in most companies?
Well, it's interesting because it's lots of organizations use an enterprise model. The enterprise owner is normally the CFO, and the CFO has probably the least amount of knowledge of how to run an asset. In some organizations, they'll have the operating officers, chief operating officer will actually be the champion of the asset space. But it's one of those areas that because it derives itself from finance usually drives the, I suppose, the way that we run our asset processes, because they're all trying to balance the cost. Whereas in today's world, we want to run them based on a life cycle and understanding of what it costs to actually operate the asset. And so that's more of an operational focus. And in businesses today, not a lot have actually taken that leap towards the operational focus.
Gotcha. Okay. Makes sense. Now, you started to talk a bit about this, but I'll ask it. Maybe we could dive a little bit more into this. But what makes EAM and enterprise asset management technology different from ERP? What's the main difference between broader enterprise technologies versus EAM?
I suppose the difference is that when we talk about ERP, we're talking about transactional type information. When we're talking EAM, we're talking functional. So we're actually saying we need to understand the details about this asset, what its performance is like. Whereas when we're actually capturing financial information, we're just doing a transaction and measuring it. And so that's essentially the difference from EAM. The other dynamic that comes in it is the function piece. Is we actually have to manage timings of when we're going to work on that asset, or when it's going to be out of service, which also then relies on its availability. So there's a lot more complexity about how we actually integrate. There's a lot more integration points where it comes to us needing to be good at our planning and scheduling, whereas with finance, it's just we're trying to measure our performance. In HR, we're trying to just identify who we actually have and how we would pay, and that we're paying on time. So there's a lot more static type functions in an ERP, whereas in an EAM, there's a lot more moving parts that you're constantly updating and constantly are changing, and that's probably the difference. Right.
Now, it seems like there'd be a lot of potential to integrate the data that you have in your core financials or your core ERP enterprise technology and EAM. Is that true, or how do you see the technology?
That's very, very true. Because if you look at any piece of work that you do on an asset, you want to know how much it costs to be able to do that. And so your financial interaction is vital in the sense that every time you do, say, a work order or whatever, you'll actually have who's going to pay for that. So it might be that you're doing a capital improvement. It might be that you're actually doing an operational. It might be that you're doing, in some cases, it might be self-funded or cross-funded sort of thing. So that allows the interaction with the finance to be able to measure and identify where those costs are actually coming from and how they're actually being applied.
Makes total sense.
Mm.
We're here with Wayne Holtham talking about enterprise asset management and what it means to your digital transformation. We'll continue the conversation when we come back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Hello and welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 75. You can find new episodes every Wednesday on LinkedIn, YouTube, and all the audio podcast platforms. Be sure to check us out there. We're in the middle of a conversation here with Wayne Holtham from Third Stage Asia Pacific talking about enterprise asset management. Let's cut back to the discussion. But what are some of the major business benefits that organizations achieve or can achieve from leveraging this sort of EAM technology?
Well, it's the benefits are really around their cost, and it's the only area where they can actually save money, I suppose, in what they provide as a service. So if you can effectively manage your asset life cycles, you can actually drive a lot more profit to your bottom line, and that's probably the big area. If you do it poorly, you can end up where the costs blow out, and that's a real challenge to manage, because it becomes an exponential cost blowout. If one thing leads to another, which leads to another, and those costs are quite can grow quite extensively. Whereas if you actually do it efficiently, you can actually improve because you're providing a service for a particular cost. If you can save because you're more efficient in the asset management space, then your profit area becomes far greater, and so it's a real upside to it, and if you do it well, you can save between 60 and 80% on what it would traditionally cost, say 5 or 6 years ago in managing assets. So it's come a long way to be able to manage assets effectively, because there's a lot more opportunities to do that.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. And earlier in my career, I did a lot of work in energy and utilities, and I know asset management was a big deal to them, and still is a big deal to them, as you mentioned. But one thing I remember from doing a lot of work in that space was that a lot of utilities had this whole mindset of wanting to sweat the assets. So in other words, to get as much out of it as you can before you have to replace it, and really being able to recognize, the assets that maybe you can milk them for longer, for lack of a better word, and then there's others you might have to do something sooner. But it kind of begs the question of, when you look at CapEx versus OpEx, the capital spending versus your operating cost, do you see a difference in the benefits that companies can achieve either in their day-to-day maintenance and operating cost versus the bigger capital spend and outlays?
Yeah, and it's interesting you say about sweating the assets. In the past, we would assume a life of an asset, whereas today we have the technology that allows us to look at this, all of the health properties that an asset might be sending back to us, information about how it's performing, like our own health check as such. And so that allows us to be able to sweat the asset, but not risk the failure. And I suppose that's that difference. So we can actually maximize how long we run that asset, and then plan for that capital investment to actually do that renewal in a time which suits the business or suits the service that we're doing. So the impact of it being out of service isn't as great. And so that's probably that bit of a difference when it comes to what we would have experienced in the past to what today is available to us.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes total sense. What about the vendors, the software vendors that provide this sort of technology? Who are just a few examples of some of the leading EAM technology vendors?
Well, all of the big players are in there. SAP, S4 is in there as an EAM space, which is probably a big player in the market. You've got your Oracle and JDE, the couple of brands that they actually run in there. You've got IBM, they run Maximo. You've got Microsoft with AX Dynamics. There's a couple of probably niche players in there. There's the Hitachi ABB, they run Ellipse, which has probably been under a lot of different company banners over the years, but Ellipse is still a very prominent product in the energy space. Maintenance Connection is a total SaaS option. Infor runs a cloud suite. So in their manufacturing, they run a lot of asset management in the manufacturing space. They have a good suite there. One Upkeep, e-maintenance, and another smaller one, which is MVP Plant. And so that's probably the top 10 players in that game as such.
Okay. So even though you mentioned before that EAM and ERP are distinctly different, it sounds like you still have options in terms of either going out and finding a EAM specialized type of technology, or if you're implementing an ERP system, some of the vendors like SAP and Oracle and Infor and Microsoft, like you mentioned, they tend to have an EAM module or offering that can kind of bolt onto their ERP. Is that true? Yeah,
that's exactly right. And now we've got the opportunity where best of breed is starting to, I suppose, technology's evolved to the point where ERPs are a lot more, have a greater ability to be able to integrate with other type systems, whether it be HCM systems or whether it be CRM systems, or some of the EAM systems are similar in that sense. So you could have an ERP and then put a best of breed EAM solution on the front end to be able to manage your assets. And probably companies like Oracle and SAP don't prefer that, but definitely that's an option in today's world.
Gotcha. Okay, great. That makes total sense. All right. So how has EAM technology changed in recent times? Earlier you were talking about the early days of EAM, but just in more recent years, how has the technology evolved? How has it improved? What are some of the major advancements that some of these vendors are making?
A lot of it is in the information availability. So, if you look at a lot of these systems here, instead of having to search and find information about an asset or how it's performing or whatever, they've now developed it to the point where that information is there and available to the user, to either the asset manager or whatever. And so they can actually see, we've got this starting to show signs of failure. And so we need to start planning early to be able to do this. Whereas in the past, it was that thing of someone might pick it up, they might not pick it up, and then you would start to plan. And so today, the inside information that technology offers is far superior than what we've had in the past.
Okay. The technology's changed quite a bit. There's a lot of options out there in the marketplace, and it seems like it could be a bit overwhelming if you're an organization, you're not really sure where to start or how to get started on the journey. What sort of advice would you give to organizations in terms of just identifying the best EAM options for them that might best fit their needs?
I think they really need to understand what they're looking for out of their system. So, EAM presents a challenge in the sense that it's data hungry. So if you've got systems that are fairly old, you haven't really taken a lot of energy to actually maintain the information about your assets, your systems and processes aren't really solid and robust, then you need to really understand that, because any of the new systems you put in will cause a lot of issues, because you will not get the benefit out of them because of the amount of data that they require to be able to give the information that they're really known for. And so when the evaluation comes, it's not just buying something that is, this looks great from a user interface, it's understanding what sits behind that. And that's, I suppose, that's that evaluation piece of how mature are we with our systems and processes. And, most times with EAM, a lot of the users are very comfortable with looking at adopting new processes. But if it becomes overwhelming, they will just pull away, and you end up with a gap between the functionality and what you're actually trying to achieve.
Right. So having someone like the third stage team that's independent and agnostic can really help navigate some of the differences and the nuances of the different technologies relative to your needs. It sounds like that could be a value to organizations that are trying to pick a solution.
Yeah, it is, and it's confusing at the moment in the sense that a vendor will come in and say, I have the best system, and they'll demonstrate it and make it look like it really works well. Then you'll have a system integrator. You might ask a trusted system integrator, and that system integrator doesn't really share with you that they actually have relationships with, say, an Oracle, with an SAP, with a whatever. And so it just depends which partner comes in and actually shares their vision of what you should be selecting. And so, and if you walked into I talked to a different partner within that same organization, he might give you a completely different story. So it's about breaking down that bias that many have when they actually are associated to a particular vendor or many vendors. And so, so that independence really does help, because the questions that an independent might ask are answers that a vendor usually shudders in answering, because they're the ones that really unpack what they're looking for.
Right. Now, what about when it comes time to go implement a new technology? Let's say you find the right solution for you, and now you're ready to go implement and make that change to your business. What are some of the challenges and pitfalls you've seen organizations struggle with when they're trying to deploy these sorts of technologies?
Well, EAM is a bit more of a challenge than ERP in the sense that it touches every area of the business. So, it will change what you're doing in finance. It will change what you're doing in HR. It will change what you're doing in supply chain. And so it's about managing all of those complexities that it adds, in the sense that you've got, all of these areas being touched, processes are being changed, information requirements are even greater. And so, really what you need to be able to do is understand your phase of what you're actually delivering. So you need to know, as you go from phase to phase, you've actually completed all of what you intended to do in the first phase, say discovery phase. And then as you roll through that life cycle of the project, that you've actually completed and you understand where you're at each time. Because every bit you miss in each of the earlier stages becomes a real challenge when you try and go live and deploy. So, yeah,
that's interesting, and it's really interesting to hear you talk about how, and I had forgotten this in my past experience with EAM, that there really is a really broad impact to an organization. Even if you're just implementing EAM, it doesn't mean that you're not going to impact other parts of the organization that maybe aren't directly using the solution. So it sounds like in terms of other upstream and downstream processes, it sounds like those people and those processes will be impacted even if they're not direct users of the technology. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly right. And it's one of those things, because and also putting EAM in, it's about looking at the driver. So if I'm managing an asset, I want to look at the life cycle costs of an asset, whereas but that won't actually align my financials with my financials as such. And so there's always that bit of a difference between what finance are looking as an objective and what the assets managers are looking at as an objective. And so there's a bit of tension always when it comes to who should drive what the cost of chart of accounts looks like, and the cost allocation methodologies and those sort of things that are probably the integration point for EAM and ERP.
Yeah, that's sound advice. I appreciate your feedback on this, and we're about out of time, but I want to thank you, Wayne, for being here today. This was a great discussion and pretty eye-opening and interesting to hear about a technology that's not always top of mind when companies think about their digital transformations, but it can have a huge impact, it sounds like, on a lot of different organizations. So thank you for being here today.
No, my pleasure. And it's good to be able to talk about the subject that's dear to my heart. So
yeah, that always makes it fun.
All right, thanks, Wayne. Great discussion. We're going to unpack some of those concepts here in just a moment. But first, we'll take a quick break. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control. Hi, this is Eric Kimberling, the CEO of Third Stage Consulting, and we recently hosted our Digital Stratosphere 2022 virtual event.
It's 3 days of packed content related to digital transformation best practices, about 16 or 18 different workshops and different speakers that are presenting on different topics, everything you need to know about transformation. The bad news is if you miss that event, the event's over. The live event already happened. But the good news, if you've missed it, or even if you did attend it and you want to see replays or you want to catch the sessions you missed, you can do that now by going to stratosphere2022.com. Go to stratosphere2022.com, register. All you have to do is put in your name and email address, just a few fields. You get immediate access to all the recordings. And the recordings cover everything from digital strategy, software selection, organizational change, process improvement, architecture, data migration, cloud, trends in the industry, how to avoid failure, some of the legal aspects to think about, contractual aspects to think about as it relates to your transformation. All that is stuff that you'll get by registering for Stratosphere 2022 replay. And again, go to stratosphere2022.com and you can listen to all the replays of all the workshops that you might have missed at the event. So hope you check it out, and thanks for listening. We'll see you soon. Bad to the bone. Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 75. I'm here with Kyler Cheatham. And Kyler, we just completed this, or replayed you, I should say, this clip from or with Wayne Holtham from Third Stage Asia Pacific, talking about enterprise asset management. What were some of your takeaways? And by the way, you mentioned before we filmed this podcast that you enjoyed that conversation. So I'm just curious what you liked about it and what questions and what sort of resonated with you from that conversation.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I'm always so impressed by Wayne. We do a lot of technical subjects and content with him, and he not only has this finesse of making things really clear and easy to understand, but he's also an expert in everything. He's an expert in process mining. And, there's so many things that he brings to the table that you don't realize until you actually get in these conversations with him. So I really enjoy learning his skill set in these different areas that might be more niche to the industries I mentioned before. So one thing I wanted to kind of dig into is just the asset. You guys mentioned the highly asset intensive life cycle. So you talked about kind of bringing the asset into the system and managing to the life cycle in different areas to create that proactive approach if a system or a machinery piece has maintenance or something like that. So when it comes to life cycle ideas that might not be in heavy machinery or in other areas that you could potentially look at as far as asset management, can you give some examples of those that might be more in kind of the utilities place, the shipping ports, those types of things, as opposed to like bigger oil and gas and mining?
Yeah. And he, speaking of being an expert in so many things, not only is he an expert in process mining, but he's done a lot of work in mining as an industry too.
Oh yeah, sure.
Too.
Yeah.
Well, I'll just give some examples. I mean, in the utilities space, maybe not oil and gas, but more the local utility space, let's say electric and gas utilities, water utilities. There's so many assets that they're managing, ranging from, in electric utilities, which is the industry I was in for about 4 years. I specialized for a period in energy and utilities. And some of the assets that they're trying to manage and maintain and optimize are things, bigger assets like substations that are generating a lot of the power. But also when you get into like all the poles and wires that are distributing the electricity, or the underground wires, which is the way it's built today. But back in the day, they were building the poles and wires above ground. Those are all assets that are pretty expensive. I mean, you have the transformers and all this different stuff on the poles. You've got the wires, and they all have to be maintained. And each one on its own individually may not be super high value, but you add up all the poles and wires and transformers and substations and all that stuff that electric utility has, and that's a lot of assets. And so enterprise asset management allows them to not only make sure that they have the right parts in place to support and maintain those assets, but also predictively anticipate when there might be a problem or where there might be, a potential breakdown. And so trying to anticipate that, reduces outages. And obviously one of the big mandates or objectives of a utility is to make sure that you've got reliable power. So that's why asset management is so important to those organizations. But then you think about, those are just the assets in the field. Then you've got trucks. You've got trucks with equipment on them and inventory. So you're trying to manage all this stuff out in the field. And so those are assets that need to be managed as well. So if you're any organization that's highly asset intensive, that has trucks, machines, robots, obviously industrial equipment, manufacturing shop floors, some of those machines that automate manufacturing shop floors, some of those are multi-million-dollar assets, and you need to, maintain those and track data behind it. So it's more industries than you'd think that can benefit from enterprise asset management solutions.
Sure, absolutely. And that manual reactive approach that you talked about, what would you do if you didn't have enterprise asset management systems? What have you seen? It seems to me that the level of disrupt industries would be much heavier if you were in that more reactive manual approach. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. It is. But at the same time, there's a mentality that I think is probably going away somewhat at least in the energy and utility space, which is there was a mentality for a lot of the utilities companies I worked for back in the early 2000s when I was in the space. There's a mentality that you would sweat. They call it sweating the assets. Like basically, we're going to get as much out of the assets as we can, and basically keep it operational until it just breaks, and then we'll just replace it. So there's a mentality in some organizations that we'll just get as much life out of it as we can, and someday it's going to break, and then we'll deal with it. A lot of times that is more expensive, especially if you haven't anticipated some of the problems to where you actually could have potentially extended the life of that asset. And you see a lot of organizations that actually are doing that with their technology now. They've got these old systems from the 80s and 90s that they're still using. That I would consider sweating the assets. You're getting so much mileage out of it that you're way past due to replace them, and it's probably going to be pretty expensive and disruptive to now try and replace something that much later. Whereas you might have been better off getting ahead of that and more selectively and slowly replacing some of those assets. So rather than operating in chaos and being reactive, it's usually cheaper to be proactive and planning ahead and anticipating where the needs are.
And that's actually a perfect segue into my next question. I was really interested when you asked him who should be managing this, as far as what are the roles and responsibilities. And he said, well, typically these systems are managed by a CFO, which is also kind of similar to what we see with software, right? And he had mentioned that is not the right person to be in charge of asset management, as they have very little knowledge of what the asset needs. So how does the CFO get all this power all the time? Like, it's always seems to run into them. And how can organizations look to what executive member is the right person to be able to effectively speak to and build these strategies?
Well, I think a problem that a lot of organizations have with capital intensive types of industries, but also just organizations that are operating technology, is that they take something like technology or capital assets, something that's really expensive, costs a lot of money, and has a lot of risk if we don't manage it well, and they sort of throw it on the CFO's desk and say, well, CFO's job is to mitigate risk and to optimize costs and all that stuff. So it sort of makes sense on the surface, but the problem is it's a fairly myopic view. It's a myopic ask that you have typically of a CFO. CFOs generally, their mindset, their skill set, their responsibility is not to optimize the assets, not to optimize the customer experience and minimize the disruption. Their job is generally to contain costs and optimize costs and all that stuff. Now, if they're thinking truly long term, to your previous question, they're going to recognize, if they knew better, they would recognize that it's cheaper in the long term just to proactively fix this stuff or proactively maintain it versus fixing it when it breaks. But they don't always know, to your point. They're not necessarily the right people. So I think a lot of times you need, you can certainly have CFO involvement. I mean, they're critical to
always. Yeah.
But an operations person might be better to do someone that really understands the implications, both the pros and the cons and the trade-offs and all that stuff. And then the CFO can obviously provide important input as a stakeholder.
Well, that sounds scary, and I'm very grateful that our CFO is not at all scary here at Thursday.
Well, I'm married to her, so I have a different perspective, but
But
we won't get into that. We've already done enough therapy for this.
we
This
have.
episode.
There's enough feelings wrapped up in this episode.
Right.
So I had one last question about integration points when you talked about this system in particular, an enterprise asset management system, a lot of times has a lot more integration points with other systems throughout the organization than say another best of breed system or an ERP system, those types of things. So they don't just measure performance. The enterprise management system, as you explained, is more proactive in managing timing and availability, those types of things. They involve planning, scheduling, those types of other pieces. So when you are looking at an enterprise asset management system and considering one, what are some integration strategies or overall considerations that you want to be mindful of when you think about what that means in integrating one of these systems?
Well, first of all, you have to understand the data implications. I mean, there's so much data that goes with asset management as it relates to not just the parts and the assets themselves, but also all the inventory and the tools and crews and skills required to support, maintain, and repair those assets. So there's just a ton of data that goes into enterprise asset management. Certainly, there's also the financial data too. Back to your point about the CFO, there's a lot of cost-related information that gets tracked in there as well. So just knowing how that data is going to flow with and interact with different systems and different workflows in the organization, upstream and downstream, that's one of the big ones, which also leads to the need for pretty solid enterprise architecture too, to figure out how you're going to tie together systems. And then certainly, from a people perspective, making sure that people understand how to use these tools and what the impacts are throughout the organization. That's a pretty big deal in utilities companies, because if your people in the field that are maintaining, repairing assets, if they don't know how to track stuff in the system, or if they're not using the system correctly, that has huge implications upstream and downstream in the overall workflows.
Absolutely. Those are all great points, and something that actually is a nice segue to our business process management conversation with Brian LaCarrubba and one of our consultants, Kameron Carpenter.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually business process management would be another response I'd give to that last question, which is you need to clearly define those processes and workflows, because it's a fairly complex set of processes when you get into maintenance, repair, and optimization, all that stuff. But regardless, even if you're not into enterprise asset management, whatever part of the business you might be working in or thinking most about, business process management is extremely important. And so what we wanted to do is have a conversation here where we talk about, what's the best approach to take with business process management? How do we get started? What do we do with our as-is? Do we focus on our as-is? How do we get to the to-be? How do we identify improvements? How do we do the process mapping? All that stuff. We wanted to unpack a bit. So rather than you and I talking about it, we thought it'd be good to have two consultants on the show who actually do this every day for a living. Unfortunately, you and I don't do as much of that hands-on work anymore, but they're going to be a little more credible in that way. So we thought we'd bring on Kameron Carpenter and Brian LaCarrubba from the Third Stage Consulting team to talk that through with us. So we're going to get to that, but first we'll take a quick break. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control. So is this one, I forgot which conversation this is. Is this the one where, this isn't the one where they're like showing examples of
No.
Okay.
No, it's not like a whiteboard session. It really,
Okay.
Cameron Carpenter did an excellent job of just asking Brian LaCarrubba questions about truly what is business process management. So it's a very baseline understanding of the overall science of business process management. So they just, again, it was just kind of one of those videos that we just did, and it's on our YouTube channel. And I selected it because it's a high performer, but we've never used it in any cross collaborative marketing tactics. So I think it's a good opportunity to bring it in.
So just setting it up, what does he just talk about how to do process mapping, or does he just get more conceptually into like as is, to be, process improvement, all that stuff? Just so I know how to set it up.
Absolutely. So he talks about again, that foundational, what is business process management? How does your business work? What are those effectiveness and efficiency tactics? And then when you are going through a digital transformation, how do you make sure that you're ensuring that your business process management or your business processes are ready and optimized for a new technology?
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstageconsulting.com.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 75, and I'm here with Kyler Cheatham. We just had a conversation about enterprise asset management, and toward the end of that conversation, we started talking about business processes and business process management, which leads us to this conversation, or this next segment, which is an overview of what is business process management. How does it relate to a digital transformation? How do you get started on it? All that good stuff. And to help us unpack that and understand that topic a bit more, we thought it'd be helpful to have two of our more senior team members from within Third Stage Consulting to unpack that for us. And so joining us on the show here is Kameron Carpenter and Brian LaCarrubba, who are both based out of our U.S. or North American office / headquarters. And that'll be good to have them on the show to talk this through. So with that being said, we're going to cut to this clip of Kameron, who's interviewing Brian LaCarrubba about some of the top of mind sorts of things as it relates to business process management. So let's cut to the clip here.
Hello, welcome to this Q&A discussion on business process management. My name is Kameron Carpenter. I am an associate consultant with Third Stage Consulting Group, and my experience spans multiple industries from manufacturing through architecture, engineering, construction. I did non-for-profits, professional services, working on multiple projects in the ERP, digital transformation, and change management initiatives. We are here. This is a video, one series of video that Third Stage has been putting out. And I have with me Brian LaCarrubba, manager for Third Stage Consulting Group. Brian, if you want to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Cameron. Happy to be here, and thank you all for who are watching this video today. So just to give a little background on myself, I'm, as Cameron said, a manager at Third Stage. I started my career in the financial operations world, and I was always looking for ways to make things better and to improve the processes that we did and make them more efficient. And from there, I went into a variety of roles using process improvement techniques, and did that in a variety of settings and contexts. Sometimes they were pure business process improvement type roles. Other times they were hybrids connecting to areas like project management, business intelligence, and large software implementations. So I've been doing that for, started down that journey really over a dozen years ago. I am certified as a Six Sigma Black Belt, which many of you will be familiar with that, as well as a certified process professional. That's through the BP group, a certification that's really one kind of ruthlessly focused on the customer experience, aligning your process around what your customers need, and making sure that everything you're doing as an organization is devoted to that. So through these, I've gained a really broad-based background in process management and how it ties into what you're doing as an organization. So I'll be talking some today about ways that this can help you.
Excellent. Thank you, Brian, for that introduction. And for those watching, Brian is a Visio wizard, can process map on the fly. So happy to have this discussion with you today. So let's just go ahead and jump right in and get started with this, Brian. First and foremost, what is business process management or process improvement?
Sure thing, Cameron. And it's important too. People listening are going to have a variety of different degrees of exposure to this. So depending on where you're at in your journey of familiarity here, you may have heard a lot of different terms, whether it's Six Sigma or BPM, TQM, process reengineering, continuous improvement. There's a number of different methodologies and frameworks and tools out there, and they all have different areas of focus. They all have value. But for what we're going to get into today, I really want to focus more on the similarities and what they mean for your organization, and not worry too much about the distinctions of what each of those techniques are. So really the guiding principle around this, what's critical is that how your organization gets work done, that is central to your mission and to what you're trying to do. So it's your processes that are what connect your people to your customers and to your organization's goals. So managing your processes, it's about understanding what your processes are, how they're getting done, how well they're getting done. It's about aligning them to your goals, making sure that they're serving your organization the way that they need to. It's about managing the effectiveness of these processes and ensuring that the effectiveness and the efficiency, I should say, ensuring that the way your people are getting work done is really serving what you need and that you have an eye into how that's happening. And it's about continuously monitoring and improving that. So to the extent possible, you want to be gathering data on your processes and being able to really see the health of your processes, how they're supporting what you're trying to do, and being able to focus on and improve the processes that need improvement.
Excellent. Thank you for that answer. Then one of the key words I just heard was continuous process improvement. So sounds like it's something that needs to continue. It should never just, we do it one time and we're done.
Absolutely, Cam. Yeah, it's your organization's always changing, and processes that served you well at one point in time may not serve you well in the future. And that could be for a variety of reasons. It could be because the business has changed. It could be because you've had turnover in your people. It could be because circumstances have changed around it. Processes, I don't want to conflate process and technology at all, but technology is in so much of what we do now strongly intermingled with your processes and is a key part of it. In some cases, technology is a key driver of them. In some cases, it's an add-ons. So technology, as it's changing, also has an impact on your processes. So for a variety of reasons, things are just going to be different over time, and you can't just assume that because you got things set into a good place at one time that you're fixed for the future. That said, you may find that the degree of attention you're putting on different processes over time is different. Some may be able to go through an improvement effort and a minimal amount of monitoring to be kept successful. Others really need to be more closely watched over time. Obviously it'd be great if you can put as much attention to all of your processes as you can over time, but just recognizing limitations and resources, you do need to have a good understanding of what are the processes you have out there, how important are they, which ones are you going to put your time and attention to and devote your resources to.
Excellent. Well, thank you for elaborating on that. And I think this would be a good time to switch gears here, and we'll maybe ask who should be involved in this business process management or process improvement?
Sure thing, Cam. So there are a variety of roles you want to get involved in this. And one of the key areas that I haven't brought up in this that's important here is the idea of cross-functional processes and looking at your processes end to end. So often you may have teams that do some work on their own processes. They may do brown bag sessions and map things out and say, this is what we need to improve, but they may not be optimizing for that end-to-end experience. So defining your processes in an end-to-end fashion is a key part of that. And so doing, it means that when you want to undertake process efforts, you need to be able to bring in these cross-functional teams who are involved in the end-to-end process. So you don't just want to have, say, an operations team without having the sales team that's connected to it. You need to make sure that you are closely linked. And it's not to say every single session involving every process needs to touch on everyone, but you need to make sure you're really looking at where are the handoffs and processes and how do you engage the people across them. So the types of roles you're going to have in this, you'll need to have subject matter experts who have familiarity in different key areas. And you need to make sure too that these are people who know on the ground what's happening. You may have very knowledgeable managers who have a good understanding of the big picture and what's happening, but it's often true that they're disconnected from the reality of day to day, what's happening in those processes. It's not to say they are by definition, but you need to be careful that you're not just assuming that someone who oversees the process actually knows how it's getting done. So in addition to those subject matter experts, you should have business process owners, people who are responsible for that end-to-end process. And a lot of organizations may have done exercises of defining and assigning business process owners, or they may not have. So that's really a key role where you need to make sure that there is a person who is accountable to the health of that process and who's going to be overseeing it over time. And the other piece you need to bring in, of course, is someone to facilitate sessions. So there are different roles that can do this, and depending on the type of effort you're getting in, you may look for people with a vast amount of experience in doing something like this, business process analysts, someone with, whether or not certifications can be a good thing. It's not just certifications that matter, and people can learn to do this. But this is a type of area where if you don't have people who have experience in this, you're going to need some help. That's an area where there's organizations like Third Stage that we can step in and help with something like this. And there are plenty of ways to get some outside help if you don't have that skill set within your organization.
Awesome, thank you. And thank you for distinguishing the difference between a business process owner and subject matter expert. I know that sometimes there's confusion during sessions that there's a mix-up. And so is there anything additional that we need to show to distinguish? Like the business process owner is more so responsible for that process, like they're going to sign it off. The subject matter expert, it could be a number of people working underneath them in different departments, like you said. Are there anything else that we can distinguish the difference between? When you have workshop sessions, are you bringing in the business process owners with all the subject matter experts? What's that kind of look like?
It's important that you need to understand your organization, what the roles people are doing, and how they're going to contribute to a session like this. So, one of the key things you want to make sure, and I'll get around to directly answering this question, Cam, but just for some background on it, you want to make sure that the people you have involved are ones who are able to both understand the process and be able to think towards what the future state needs to be and look to build onto what are you trying to get to. They need to be able to make some degree of decisions in there, but your subject matter experts are the people who can really help drive things out and help you understand where you're at today and some direction on where you're going tomorrow. But it's the business process owners who really need to be accountable for making the decisions and being able to say, yes, this is absolutely what we want to do or not. And they're also responsible for setting direction. That comes from various directions, roles within the organization who are going to help with that. So if you need to make sure what are you trying to get out of this initiative? Are you trying to standardize your processes? Are you trying to bring together different locations onto something common? Are you trying to just aim for greater efficiency and have improvement in that way of meeting certain metrics around whether it's quality or time to complete, customer satisfaction? Obviously, everything's got to be linked towards your customers' goals in the end, but making sure that you are really clear on what the direction is and what you're trying to get to. So ultimately, it's the business process owner who needs to be accountable for that within. So they have a key role for sure in the before any changes are implemented in your processes, that they're the ones who need to be comfortable that that's the direction you want to go. The subject matter experts are the ones who can really help identify a lot of those things on the ground that you need to do. So just to tie it back to where you were coming from in your question, it really depends on what your skill sets are of your subject matter experts and your BPO, your business process owner. Are they going to add value sitting through this time and working through the mapping with people and defining everything, or are they best positioned to do a review after the fact and help set some direction based on those things that are found? And your subject matter experts, are they capable without the guidance in the room or but just from the facilitator to be able to set some of that direction and pick the future state? Or are you going to end up having a session where your SMEs are coming up with a bunch of ideas, but then you bring them over to your process owners later and find that these things are based on taking things from where we are today and improving them, as opposed to setting a new way of doing work that you want to get to. So you really need to have a clear understanding of where you're trying to get to and what your skill sets are for people to be able to get there.
We're here with Cameron and Brian talking about business process management. We're going to continue the conversation when we return with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 75. We're here with Brian LaCarrubba and Kameron Carpenter talking about what is business process management.
There was one thing you mentioned, it was initiatives, and I think this would be a good time to maybe link up process improvement to digital transformations. So what does that look like?
Absolutely. So, organizations, the term digital transformation, some may think of as a buzzword, and it can mean a lot of different things. It is to a degree, but it's a helpful umbrella in which to think about the impact of technology and what it has on our organizations and how you're trying to modernize and use technology to your advantage. And as I mentioned earlier, processes are not they're not your technology directly, but technology does have a big impact on things. So I don't think of process as strictly it's driven by technology. It's your processes that really drive what your technology needs to be, and you need to align that, but the capabilities you get out of technology are important. So as you're looking into an effort where whatever kind of project you're doing or initiative you're undertaking that is connected to your business processes, those processes and your business or organizational goals are what you need to think about in terms of driving that forward. So if you're in the early stages of saying, for example, we want to get a new ERP system, we want to drive our organization forward and increase efficiencies in our supply chain, in our purchasing, in our manufacturing, in our finance, HR, whatever it is you're trying to improve there, you want to make sure that that initiative and the technology you go with is aligned to where you want your processes to be. You don't just want to jump into, let's pick a technology and assume we're just going to latch on to whatever that technology has to offer, and our business will follow suit. That's a recipe for failure if you just assume the technology alone is going to make those changes. You may decide that you want to follow those, hate to use this term, but it may apply here. There are some scenarios where just using best practice technology processes within a technology is the direction you want to go. But that needs to be a well thought out and considered decision where you're still understanding that some parts of your business may not fit into that. You need to understand, really put the time and effort into what it is you're trying to do and how is that going to drive the technology decision, and making sure that anything you're doing from a technology perspective is aligned around where does your business and your organization trying to go.
Excellent. I think the big driver there is the business drives technology, not the other way around. And so that was a great message. And I think that kind of rolls into, how does a company's future depend on process improvement, whether it's digital transformation initiatives or just generally business process management, which is a continuous process throughout the company's life. So how does this future depend on it?
Yes, it's critical. This is, of course, an interesting time to be doing this as we're recording this in late March of 2020, and we know the world is undergoing fast changes. Organizations, they look different, very different in many ways now than they did a month ago, as we're dealing with the impacts of COVID-19 and what the stay-at-home measures and social distancing are doing for organizations and their customers and their businesses. It's a time of dramatic change, and this is looking at your process is one of the key things you can do around that to deal with this uncertain future. If you're in a place where your business is struggling as a result of a sudden downturn that's through no fault of your own, this is one of the things you can do, is look at your processes and see how they can be modified to meet the changing circumstances. Are there areas where you may have people that can be redeployed to doing things a little differently? Do you have the ability to roll out some new products or services that are central, close to what you do today, but may require some change in the way you work in order to operate. So these are things that are strategic goals, but the execution of that strategy is driven by processes. And so it's looking at your processes that can enable you to do that. You may be in a position today where suddenly, say if you're in a food business or a medical device type business or something that's really stepping up in these times, you may need to then, you're dealing with influx of demand that you are not used to handling, and it may be driving out differences, gaps in your processes that you haven't seen before, or maybe you've seen them and didn't think they were as impactful as now suddenly as your volume increases and your expectations are higher and higher from your customers, that you need to take a look at these things and get them fixed now. So processes always enable you a mix of some quick win improvements, things you can step in and do now just by getting people together and taking a look at what you do, as well as driving strategic goals for the future and being able to align your organization around where you're trying to go. And again, I just want to tie it back to what I said earlier. This is that your processes are what connect your people to your customers, to your end goals. And so to Cameron's question about how does this impact your future, it's the business processes that are really at the ground floor of making things happen, and the execution on what you believe is important and what your strategy is. Your people are the key to that happening, but your people get work done through processes. So it's being able to have a good understanding of and an ability to make those, shape those processes around what you're trying to do. That's critical to surviving and stepping out above your competition to do what you need to do.
Excellent. And definitely, as things can slow down for some other industries, this might be the perfect time when they're having that remote workforce to bring people together and start focusing on these processes. It's something that you can do and something that's necessary. And without knowing the timeline of how long we're going to be on this, slow moving business trend for some industries, maybe we can, companies can try to enhance those processes. I would say, with everything we've discussed today in business process management, do you have any additional thoughts, comments that you'd like to add in general, final thoughts for people watching, to key takeaways from this video?
Yeah, I think another thing I'd like to just drive home, and I've only made kind of indirect reference to it here, but it is that your people are so intermingled and directly connected to your processes that you can't think of processes as just sort of a mechanic technical exercise. And as you're making changes to your processes, recognizing that these have an impact on your people, the way they do work, and even people have an identity of what they are as a worker, and if you're making changes to processes, that is something that can drastically change the way they view things and how they operate. So it's really important to make sure to continue to look at the people side of things, and as you're doing these processes, as you're implementing improvements, that you're looking at the impact to your people and undergoing organizational change management activities that are going to help you and help your people to adapt to any new realities that come about. And some of these things may seem small, but if people are used to a certain way of communicating and interacting with their coworkers, and that gets changed, and in some cases it may be, again, one we're seeing a lot today is remote work. Someone may have turned to the person behind them to hand off a paper every day, and now they have to do it remotely, and it may be more efficient and easier and more trackable to do it remotely, but you recognize there's a difference in the way people are connecting and getting work done and the way they think about it. So you can't just assume, just by saying this looks more efficient on paper, that it's going to happen that way. You have to think about the people aspect of it if you want to make sure you're achieving your goals out of this.
Well, thank you, Cameron. Thank you, Brian. Great conversation, very helpful, very relevant conversation too. That's something that we get asked all the time by our clients, is how do you address business process management? What is it? How do we get started? How does it tie into our transformation? All that good stuff. So hopefully their discussion there helped unpack that and answer some of the questions in a bit more detail. In fact, it also triggered some other comments and thoughts that we'll get to here, that Kyler and I will get to here in a second. First, we'll take a quick break. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the 2021 Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how to take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 75. I'm here with Kyler, and Kyler, we just had this great conversation with Brian and Kameron talking about business process management. What were your thoughts on that discussion?
Yeah, this discussion is important not only for people that are newer to digital transformation, business process management, overall operations, but it's also, I think, important for people that are really a senior level business process management operations specialist, because it breaks down and helps us remember what actually is business process management and what is the objective of it. So Brian LaCarrubba, I think, said it perfectly. He said, how your organization gets work done. That is business process management. And that effectiveness and the efficiencies of how you do that. And the thing that I really want to dig into you is, I have an opinion with no base in insight or fact, but I would say that it's very difficult to identify your own business process management. Like, it's almost one of those things, like we talked about the audit sphere of like coming in and having fresh eyes. Of like, what is what is the processes? What are opportunities to optimize those processes? So I wonder if you could actually correct me if I'm wrong, or give us some factual basis. And how difficult is it to do this internally, as far as exercises from an objective and strategic scope?
Well, I think it's very difficult, partly because it's hard to back away and look at the big picture and see things objectively when you're involved in it every day. The other part of it that makes it difficult is when you're involved in it every day, you're not only involved in the business processes every day, but you're involved in the organizational dynamics and the politics every day. And so it's a lot harder to challenge the way things have been when you're an internal person, because you are part of the status quo, even if you don't mean to be, you just are. And you have, internal organizational political dynamics at play if you do push back on why things are being done a certain way. Because you and I work together, Kyler, if I say something and challenge you in a certain way, that's probably going to offend you more, and you might take it a little bit more personally than someone listening to the show that you've never met before, for example. There's just something about that, familiarity and the threat that poses when someone that you're working with challenges things like that. So those are a couple of reasons why. And then, of course, I guess a third thing I'd say that makes it challenging is that so many organizations have teams that are highly tenured, that have been at that organization for a long time, and that's sort of all they know, or it's most of what they know as far as how things could be. So having that outside perspective, people that see other organizations, they see best practices, they see more optimized ways of doing things. They're part of helping organizations optimize the way they do things. Bringing that outside perspective and competency to the table during business process management is hugely important. So those are three of the things that come to mind.
Yeah, I think that's well said, and really speaks to that collaborative approach, right? There, of course, having a business process expert, having an expert in anything, right, is helpful to come in and just give that unbiased, objective perspective. But you still do have to own your own business processes and understand how they affect your overall objectives and ROI, most importantly.
Right.
And that's a good segue into, Brian talked about that cross-functional approach and really being able to see the process from end to end, from start to finish, and how many different people that involves. And you just kind of touched on, it can sometimes be difficult in working together throughout an organization to say, your process is broken, mine is right, those types of things. So as someone who is a change management expert and kind of an expert in that therapeutic approach from a business standpoint, how do you create a safe environment to talk about, like, hey, this is our objective as a business? Doesn't mean anyone's doing a bad job, right? It just means that there's opportunity for us to grow.
Yeah, and a lot of it is the simple little things in terms of how you ask the questions or how you might challenge the status quo. So in other words, instead of saying, Kyler, why do you do things, why do you do A, B, and C? I might say, have we thought about doing D, E, and F instead of A, B, and C? Or could we improve A, B, and C to do this and that? So a lot of times it's A, not making it about any one person. It's more about we and how we can work together to solve it. But also B, how can we, ask it in the form of a question, and really draw that out from people. And, you want people to push back if they don't agree, but you also don't want, that defense mechanism to go up where everything is a pushback. And you do get that sometimes, by the way. You get people that are just going to push back on any sort of change. And quite frankly, those are probably the people that aren't the best to be involved in a business process management exercise, or even an overall digital transformation for that matter.
Absolutely. And Brian touched on the business process owner. So I wondered, when we are talking about doing something end to end, there's obviously a lot of touch points within that process and a lot of different people involved. Who would be a business process owner? And can you give us a real live example of what that might look like?
Sure. So sometimes what will happen is some organizations have designated business process owners already. So you'll have someone who's, the finance business process owner, or you'll have, maybe even more granular than that, accounts payable, accounts receivable, sort of designated account business process owners. Most organizations don't, but some bigger organizations do. For most organizations that don't already have that business process owner matrix and structure in place, what they end up doing typically is identifying those business process owners as part of a transformation, as part of our business process management efforts. And in those cases, you want to look for people that certainly understand the nuances of your current state of operations, but you want those people to be open-minded to how it could be improved too. So a lot of times we look to people that have maybe been at the organization for a certain amount of time, but maybe not forever, maybe not their entire careers at that one organization. Ideally, they've had experiences at other organizations. They've seen how other organizations have worked. And you do that where possible. I mean, most organizations will be able to do that for some roles, but other business process ownership roles, it's just, you've got what you got. You've got the one person that knows that process really well, and they've been at the company forever. In the case where you've got these highly tenured employees that might not be as open or knowledgeable to how to change business processes, that's where, bringing in the outside perspective to work side by side with those business process owners can be highly effective. But then again, back to the point earlier, you want to be, to use your word, therapeutic about how you approach that. You don't want to come in like a wrecking ball and say, your process sucks. It's so manual. It's tons of, it's error prone. There's tons of rework required. Let's totally overhaul it. That's not the way you come in and do it, even if that's true. What you end up doing is you ask a lot of questions. You seek to understand. You have potential options or scenarios. What if we did this, or what if we did that? Would that help? And another thing that oftentimes helps, by the way, is to even push things, or to take the bullseye not only off individuals so they don't feel threatened, but even off teams so they don't feel threatened, is to really, rather than focusing on us, let's focus on the customer, or either our end customer and or our internal customers. How can we better service them? I mean, so we're sort of shifting the conversation from, let's talk about you, Kyler, and how your processes are so broken. Instead, we're saying, well, let's figure out how our end customer, what can we do to make these processes that we're all working on, how can we make that better to service the end customer? So those are just some tips to how to approach that. But back to your real question here, I think that's, you sort of have to deal with the limitations of the skills you do and don't have. But you can always augment that with the outside perspectives as well.
I would like to say I'm feeling personally attacked in all of the examples that you're giving.
I'm trying to change your process
Right,
while we're in the middle of a
exactly.
podcast.
It's like I triggered you earlier, and now you're, really,
Back
really
time.
drilling down, which I love the intensity. I really do. So I want to ask you, one of the comments that we got on this video from our audience kind of goes along these lines. And it's from Tamika Brown on YouTube. She asked, what industries utilize business process improvement professionals? I'm a BPM in aerospace, and I've never heard of them. I'm used to hearing terms like continuous improvement or Six Sigma black belt. Say that 10 times fast. But so I think she's kind of wondering, what that overall label means and how does it translate to an industry like aerospace?
Yeah, that's a interesting question. I honestly think that when you talk about Lean Six Sigma or continuous improvement, that sort of is in many ways business process management. Having said that, I'm also not a big believer in slicing hairs when it comes to acronyms and buzzwords and things of that nature. But in general, I mean, if you're doing continuous improvement or if you're a Lean Six Sigma specialist, that sort of is business process improvement. I mean, you're just using, I guess the difference is it's sort of predefining what the tool set or framework is you're going to start with to approach business process improvement. I know for our team, when we hire people that are going to be consultants to help with business process management improvement, we oftentimes do look for people that have experience with Six Sigma and continuous improvement, that sort of thing. So to me, it's all sort of wrapped together, one and the same.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm sure aerospace is an industry in which business process management specifically is very important, and in the fact that you're just launching stuff into space. So that seems like that would be a good aspect to have those training assets within your overall process. And the thing I'll end with is I think Brian did a great job when Cam asked him, well, what is business process improvement versus digital transformation? And he explained that business process improvement is really within the organization's circle of influence. Of course, it's always nice to have an outside perspective that can give you best practices and scale those. But I think a lot of businesses, we talked about last week, one of our case studies with our client that kind of wished that they had gone through a business process improvement exercise before letting the technology lead that they selected. So that's a piece that I think is really a great finding from this overall conversation, to be able to kind of own that in establishing that effectiveness for your own organization.
Yeah, I totally agree, for sure.
That was a great conversation, definitely. And if you have questions, I know Cameron and Brian asked the audience to reach out to them directly. And in this episode, we can include their contact information if you do have any additional questions.
Great. Yeah, that was a good conversation. And thank you to Cameron and Brian for putting together that discussion, being part of that. That was very helpful. And thank you to Wayne as well, Wayne Holtham, for being on the show to talk about enterprise asset management. And thank you, Kyler, for co-hosting the show as always.
Absolutely. It's good to know I'm just ceremonial. So I'm just going to see myself as like the royal family of ground control. Okay.
Right. You sort of are. You're becoming a celebrity here in the digital transformation space. So I have to be careful. I have to be careful not to get too intense in future episodes. So thanks for bearing with us while we had some of those controversial discussions here today. Thanks for that, and thanks to the audience too for listening in and for all the feedback that the audience provides, which stimulated a lot of the conversation here today. So I want to thank everyone for joining. We'll be back next Wednesday. You can find new episodes every Wednesday morning at 8 a.m. Eastern time in the United States. We live stream to YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter, and that's when the episode for that week drops to all the audio podcast platforms as well. So be sure to check us out every Wednesday. And leave us a review too if you wouldn't mind. We'd love to hear your feedback. So we'll appreciate your time here today. I hope you have a great week. We'll look forward to seeing you next week on Transformation Ground Control.